Hi, this is Alessio. Hope you're well. In this video, I want to take another look at the chart of Bitcoin, especially now that Bitcoin has come down to the bottom section of this channeling formation here, the channeling formation I mentioned some weeks ago. And you can see it's now hugging the bottom part of that rising trend line and this ascending channel. And I want to explain to you what this potentially means in the context of these two types of patterns. All right, guys, join me. Alright guys, welcome back. So as you may recall, a few weeks ago, I actually made a video you may have seen, which I talked about that the chart pattern is forming on Bitcoin is quite likely to be this you're seeing here, an ascending channeling pattern, which I'll talk about in more detail in this video. And as you can see here, Bitcoin has now come down to the bottom part of this ascending channel. By the way, you may actually notice that over here, we actually had a diagonal pattern, sometimes also called a wedge pattern. As you can see here, it broke out of this diagonal formation here and took out the 21 to 34 EMA, and it's now come down to the bottom section of this ascending channel pattern, as you can see here. And as a matter of fact, you can argue that what's happening here on the chart of Bitcoin right now is a sideways flag pattern here, as you can see, almost mimicking the flag pattern has been forming here for the last several weeks and months. As you can see, we'll talk more about this in a few moments, by the way. So the bottom line is, what does all of this mean in relation to Bitcoin? Well, let's take a look at this chart over here. Now, we talked earlier that what's likely happening on the chart of Bitcoin is an ascending channel, but here's something quite important. Most textbooks, and in fact, most people who talk about channels don't even mention this. Most people do not know this. And if you can understand this section, this will put you way ahead of everybody else out there. You see, there are two types of ascending channels, and they're not all the same. Some people think all channels are the same. They're not. Have a look at these two patterns and tell me what key difference you see between this one, pattern number one, and pattern number two. What is the major difference you see in these two types of ascending channel patterns? Well, if you said that this one over here, I'll tell you, here's the answer. If you said, well, pattern number one has a lot of overlap, which by the way, I talked about this in the previous video, you're absolutely correct. You're right. You see, guys, this pattern over here has a lot of overlap. As you can see here, these waves all overlap here. As you can see, up and down, up and down. But more importantly, the overlap that I'm talking about is the corrective downward projections here, okay? These corrective moves all overlap with one another, okay? They're all in the same territory as one another. You see this? But have a look over here on this right-hand side, and you'll see there's a different pattern here. In this pattern on the right-hand side, there is no overlap because you see this downward move, this downward corrective move, does not overlap with this corrective downward move, okay? They're not in the same territory as one another. From an Elliott wave perspective, you could argue that this potential wave 4 does not overlap with this potential wave 2. They're not in the same territory as one another, okay? So they're separate. And that's why this particular pattern you see over here is more likely to be bullish. As you can see, I've written down here, waves do not overlap. Waves more likely to be impulsive, in other words, more likely to be trending. And in this section here, higher probability of being bullish. Now I say probability, not certainty. So this particular pattern we're seeing here has a slightly higher probability of being bullish. Whereas this one on the left-hand side, because of the several corrective overlapping patterns we're seeing here, okay, because all these waves overlap with one another, especially the corrective waves, the problem with this ascending channel pattern over here is the waves overlap with one another. It's more likely to be corrective, and this means there's a higher probability of being bearish in nature. Again, probability, not a certainty. One important thing to mention here is that these kinds of patterns, these overlapping patterns here, the pattern number one, they're more likely to break out of the channel. Okay, so these patterns over here, they're much more likely to come down to the bottom part of the channel and then break out of it. Okay, whereas these ones, these patterns over here on the right-hand side, because they don't overlap with one another, they're much more likely to continue the uptrend. That's the key point to remember. So going back to this chart over here on Bitcoin, as we can see, Bitcoin has now come down to the bottom section of this rising ascending channel and indeed the trend line pattern formation here. And it's now hugging, as we can see here, is hugging the lower end of this trend line and the channel we're forming here. And again, as I mentioned before, because the waves over here, because these waves all overlap, as I mentioned before, okay, and especially because the corrective waves, okay, especially because these corrective waves here, these downward moves, all overlap with one another, and because price is below the 21 and 34 daily moving averages here, there's a higher probability for price to break out of this channel, okay? I know it's hugging this channel right now, it's hugging the trend line here, but at the moment, as long as price continues to remain below the 21 and 34 moving averages here, pressure continues to remain to the downside, and there's a slightly higher probability for price to take out and break out of this channel. By the way, I would need to see confirmation. So even though the price seems to be forming this kind of a, again, flag pattern here, all right, and it's below the 21 and 34 moving averages, nevertheless, we need to see confirmation, okay? And until we see confirmation, we still do not yet have a breakout from this channel, okay? So in other words, confirmation would come if it breaks this support level that I mentioned, 20,700. So if Bitcoin now falls below and takes out this 20,700 support level here, then risk increases to the downside, and it could mean we may potentially test the July and June lows. Let me now show you this, because you see there are two potential scenarios. There's not just one scenario, there are two potential outcomes and scenarios here. Now, I mentioned this in a previous video, but it's worth just remembering this. The first scenario is the obvious one, the one where price breaks out of the channel, okay, which seems likely when you have overlapping patterns like this. So price breaks out of the channel, as you can see here. Sometimes when price breaks out of the channel, it may go back and retest it, as you can see, retest, and then falls lower. It gets rejected and then falls lower to the prior support levels. For example, the prior support and the panic lows we formed when the channel first started, as you can see here. So that's one potential scenario. By the way, let me just mention again that even though this chart is showing to us a potential retest, the trend line, sometimes there's no retest, okay? It's worth just remembering that we don't always see a retest. Sometimes price just breaks out and then continues to fall lower. So that's one potential scenario, as you can see here. What's the other one? The other one, you may remember, the other potential scenario is this one, where price essentially makes a whipsaw or a false break. This is where price breaks out of the channel, then goes back to retest it, and then goes back inside the channel, as you can see here. That essentially is a false break or a whipsaw, and this actually is quite bullish. So it's worth remembering that if we see a pattern like this, if Bitcoin were to do something like this, so for example, if price breaks out of the channel, then goes back within the channel again very quickly within a few bars, as you can see here, that actually is a very bullish sign. By the way, we need to see a sustained move back within the channel to show to us the price wants to continue the uptrend, or indeed to test the prior highs within the channel. Okay, in other words, something like this, if price does something like this, a whipsaw or a false break, and goes back within the channel, the probability increases for price to retest this particular, the prior high within the channel itself, and potentially the upper part of the channel as well. All right, guys, so that's really what we have. We have two potential scenarios. One is a false break, and the other scenario is a direct breakout to retest the prior lows and the panic lows that was formed here at the start of the channel. So that's really what we have here on Bitcoin. It's a matter of just being patient and seeing what Bitcoin wants to do here, okay? For now, we're still above this support at 20,700. We just need to be patient, and let's see if we get a confirmation of that breakout. And in which case, if that happens, then risk potentially increases to the downside. All right, guys, hope this video helps. Make sure you go ahead and check out the members update, because in the members update, I've talked about the potential projections and targets for Bitcoin. And also, guys, make sure you watch the Sunday members video, because in the Sunday members video, we'll talk more about the potential wave counts and also more about the targets and projections for Bitcoin as well. And if you're not a member, you can join on that link you see right there. Thank you very much indeed. Bye for now.